Charlotte Everly pulled the engagement ring off her finger while her wedding dress was still on. She set it on the table without a word. Alexander stared at it like a man watching something precious fall into deep water, too late to catch it, too stunned to move. "Charlotte, don't," she said. "Just don't." The candles were still burning. The flowers were still arranged. The entire manor was still dressed for a wedding that would never happen. And the Duke of Ashford Vale stood alone in the room, wondering how a man with everything had somehow lost the only thing that mattered. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow every part until the very end, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning of Alexander Whitmore's wedding began the way all great disasters begin, quietly, and with every outward sign that everything was fine. The staff at Ashford Manor had been awake since before dawn. Cook had prepared a breakfast nobody touched. The groundskeepers had trimmed the hedgerows a third time. The head butler, Mr. Pemberton, had walked the entrance hall so many times checking the flower arrangements that he had worn a thin track into the carpet. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. And inside the private dressing room on the second floor, Charlotte Everly stood in front of the mirror and told herself to breathe. She was 27 years old. Not particularly tall. Not the kind of woman who stopped conversations when she entered a room. She had dark auburn hair that refused to stay pinned without a fight, and she had a small scar near the right side of her jaw, pale crescent-shaped, barely an inch long, left behind by a carriage accident 8 months ago. She did not love the scar, but she had made a kind of peace with it. It was hers. It was part of the face that Alexander had looked at and said, without hesitation, "I want to spend my life looking at you." The gown was ivory silk with a long train that the seamstress Mrs. Aldridge had spent 3 weeks adjusting. Charlotte stood very still while Mrs. Aldridge finished the final buttons at the back, each one small and covered in silk, each one pressing the dress tighter around her. "You look beautiful, miss," Mrs. Aldridge said softly. Charlotte smiled at the mirror. "Thank you, Agnes." "His Grace is a lucky man." Charlotte looked at her own reflection, at the dress, at the veil not yet placed, at the ring on her finger, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, a Whitmore family piece that was 200 years old. She felt something sitting in her chest. Not nerves, not excitement, something heavier than both. She told herself it was just the morning, just the weight of the occasion. In a few hours, she would be standing beside Alexander in the chapel, and she would look at his face, and the weight would lift, and everything she had chosen would feel true again. She believed that, right up until the moment the door opened. Alexander walked in without knocking. That was the first thing. He always knocked. It was a small thing, a private habit between them, something they had started in the early months of their courtship, a way of saying, "I see you as a person, not just a presence." He would knock twice lightly and wait for her to say, "Come in," and then he would enter, and whatever the moment was, it would be theirs together. He did not knock this morning. He walked in, and Mrs. Aldridge straightened, and Charlotte turned from the mirror, expecting to see the particular look Alexander wore when he was nervous, but trying to appear steady, the slight tension around his jaw, the eyes that went a little warmer than usual when he was working, not to show it. She knew his face that well. She expected that face. She got something else. How was dressed for the ceremony, perfectly pressed, perfectly presented, his dark hair combed back, and his cravat arranged without a crease. From any distance, he looked exactly as a duke should look on his wedding morning. But Charlotte was not looking from a distance. She watched his eyes cross the room, find her face and stop. Not on her eyes. On the scar. Just for a moment. 1 beat of a second. But she felt it the way you feel a cold draft even before you find the open window, a knowledge arriving before the understanding of it. "Charlotte." His voice was warm, measured. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she said carefully. He stepped closer. Mrs. Aldridge quietly moved to the far side of the room and made herself very busy with thread that did not need attention. Alexander looked at Charlotte for a long moment. He smiled. Then his eyes moved just slightly back to the scar. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Calm," she said. "Surprisingly calm." He nodded. "Good, good." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. I was thinking Mrs. Aldridge is very talented. I believe she may have some experience with cosmetic arrangements. Powder, perhaps. A particular color. Charlotte went still, not visibly. Nothing in her body moved. But something inside her went completely and utterly still, the way a lake goes still before a storm. Powder, she repeated. Just for the ceremony, he said quickly. Just while we are in the chapel with all those eyes. He gave a small, careful smile. You know how people look at a wedding, everything is noticed. Charlotte did not look away from him. The scar, she said. You're asking me to cover the scar. I'm not asking you to do anything. His voice remained pleasant, careful. I am offering a thought, for your comfort if nothing else. My comfort, she said slowly. Charlotte. Because it seems to me, she said, and her voice stayed very quiet, very even, that my comfort is not actually what you are thinking about. The room was silent. Mrs. Aldridge had stopped moving entirely. Alexander's expression tightened slightly at the corners. I don't want you to feel self-conscious, with all the attention on you today. You want me to cover my face, Charlotte said, because people will look at me and see the scar, and it will not look the way you imagined. That is not what I... Is it about how I feel, she asked, or is it about how it looks? The silence that followed that question was not empty. It was full. It was crowded with every word he was not saying, and Charlotte heard every single one of them. Alexander exhaled. There are certain appearances, he said carefully, that a duke's household must maintain. I am not speaking as a man who loves you less. I am speaking as a man who is responsible for a legacy. Appearances, Charlotte said. You know what I mean. I know exactly what you mean. She turned back to the mirror. She looked at her own face. The scar. The ivory dress. The ring on her finger catching the morning light. I have known what you mean for a long time. Charlotte. I would like a few minutes alone, she said. He hesitated. She watched his reflection, the slight tightening of his hands, the small war between what he wanted to say and what he knew he shouldn't. Then he gave a short nod, and he left, and the door closed behind him. Mrs. Aldridge looked at Charlotte in the mirror. Charlotte looked at herself. Neither of them spoke. The thing about the scar was not the scar. Charlotte had understood this for months, even while she tried not to understand it, even while she arranged her understanding into a shape she could live with comfortably. The accident had happened in February. A hired carriage. A patch of ice on a narrow road. The fall was quick, a lurch, a sound she could still hear on certain nights, and then stillness and pain, and the cold pressing of the road against her face. The wound had healed well. The doctor said she was fortunate, and she had told herself the same thing. You are fortunate. The scar is small. It does not define you. The person who loves you will not see it as a flaw. Alexander had said exactly that. She remembered the afternoon. She first let him see it without the careful positioning she had adopted in the early weeks. The slight angling of her face, the habit of touching that side briefly before turning toward him as if she could redirect his gaze by sheer will. She had stopped doing it one afternoon in his library. She had simply turned and looked at him directly and said, I want you to look at it properly, just once, without me preparing you for it. And he had looked. And then he had crossed the room, and he had touched the side of her face with one hand very gently, and he had said, It changes nothing. You are still the person I want standing beside me. She had believed him. She had wanted so completely to believe him. But wanting to believe something and having it be true are two different countries. And this morning, Charlotte stood at the border between them and finally understood that she had been traveling the wrong direction for a very long time. She did not stay in the dressing room. She walked down the hall carrying the train of her gown in her hands. Inelegant, she knew, utterly unlike a future duchess should move through her own wedding morning, and she went to the small sitting room at the end of the corridor where she had left her traveling case the night before. She sat down. She thought about 3 years. 3 years of dinners and letters and long afternoons in the Ashford Library. 3 years of conversations that went deeper than any she had known before him, about what she wanted, about what he wanted, about the gap between the life he had inherited and the life he sometimes imagined for himself. 3 years of being told again and again that she was the one person who did not require him to perform. That he loved her precisely because she never asked him to be anything other than exactly who he was. She had loved him for that. She had loved him for the particular gift of being seen clearly. And now she sat in her wedding gown on the morning of her wedding and heard his voice saying appearances and legacy, and people will look, and she understood that the man who had promised to see her clearly was looking at her scar and seeing something he wanted to manage. Not something he wanted to understand. Something he wanted to cover. She pressed her hands together in her lap. She felt the ring against her palm. The sapphire. The Whitmore family stone. She thought, if I cover the scar today, what will he ask me to cover next year? And the year after that? And after 20 years, what will be left of the woman he said he loved? The question sat in her chest like something solid and unavoidable. And then Charlotte Everly stood up and lifted her chin and went to find her answers. She found Alexander in the library. Howe was standing at the window with his hands behind his back, and when she entered, he turned and something in his face relaxed the relief of a man who had been bracing for the wrong thing. "Charlotte," he said, "I'm glad you—" "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to answer me honestly, not diplomatically, not carefully." She stepped into the center of the room. "I need the truth." He looked at her. "All right. When you look at me this morning," she said, "what do you see?" He opened his mouth. "Take a moment," she said. "Please, take a real moment." He did. She watched him take the question seriously, at least watched him arrange his words the way he arranged everything with precision and care, and a duke's instinct for the correct presentation. "I see the woman I love," he said, "and—" his jaw tightened slightly. "Charlotte." "And the scar," she said. "Say it." "Yes," he said quietly. "And the scar." "And the scar is a problem today." "I did not say it was a problem." "You asked me to cover it," she said. "In the language I understand, that is the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am trying to protect you." "From what?" "From what people will say." "People already say things about me," she said evenly. "They have said things about me for my entire life. My family is not prominent enough. My manner is too direct. My opinions are too present. My face is now apparently too scarred." She held his gaze. "I have been managing what people say about me for 27 years, Alexander. I do not need your protection from that. I need something else entirely." "What?" he asked. "What is it you need?" And she said very simply, "I need you to be proud of me." The word proud landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Alexander stared at her. "I am proud of you," he said. "Then why?" Charlotte said, "Did you walk into my dressing room this morning and ask me to rearrange my face before you would stand beside me in public?" He did not answer. The silence stretched. And Charlotte felt the last of something, some last-held hope, some final possibility that she had been reading him wrong, that there was an explanation she hadn't found yet dissolve quietly in her chest. She did not cry. That was the thing she noticed about herself later, that she did not cry, not in the library, not afterward. She felt something enormous moving through her, something that wanted to become grief, but it could not quite reach the surface, because underneath it there was something harder and clearer. Certainty. She knew. She had perhaps known for several months. In that way, a person knows a thing without allowing themselves to know it the way you feel a storm building while still insisting the sky looks fine. She had known since the night he introduced her to Lord Hargreaves at the Dorset reception, and she had watched Alexander's eyes flick to her face and then quickly away, as Hargreaves looked at her with that particular expression of polite assessment. She had told herself that night, he is simply navigating a social situation. He is not embarrassed. He loves you. She had told herself that a great many times. She was done telling herself that. "I'm going to ask you a question," Charlotte said, "and I need you to hear it before you answer it." "Charlotte." "Do you love the woman you believe I should become?" she said quietly. Or do you love the woman I actually am? Alexander went very still. The clock on the mantel ticked 3 times. Charlotte waited. And when he opened his mouth and began with "Charlotte, that is not a fair question to," she had her answer. Not from what he said, from what he did not say. A man who loved the woman standing in front of him would not have needed a second to find the answer. He would not have reached for fairness and deflection. He would have said simply, and without hesitation, "You. Exactly you." He did not say that. "I see," Charlotte said. She looked at the ring on her finger for a long moment. Then she pulled it off. She set it on the writing desk between them on the stack of estate correspondence he had not yet reviewed, and the small sound of it against the wood was somehow the loudest thing in the room. "Charlotte," he said. His voice had changed. Something real had cracked through the surface of it. "Charlotte, please. I am not angry with you," she said, and she meant it. The steadiness in her voice was not performance. "I believe you think you love me. I believe you have told yourself a story in which asking me to cover my face is an act of care and not an act of shame. It is not shame. But it is," she said simply. "And you should know it because the man I thought I was marrying would have known it too." He was quiet. She picked up her traveling case. "I won't hide who I am," she said. "Not for a ceremony, not for society, not to make a man comfortable who should be brave enough to be comfortable on his own." She walked to the door. "Charlotte." His voice came from directly behind her, closer than she expected. He had crossed the room without her hearing, and when she turned he was standing 3 feet away, and the careful composure was entirely gone now. He looked like what he actually was, a man who had made a terrible mistake and felt it finally in his whole body. "Please, don't. Let us talk about this properly. We have been talking properly for 3 years, she said. And you still asked me to cover my face this morning. He did not move. "I am sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "But I'm not sure you know what for." And Charlotte Everly opened the door and stepped into the hall and did not look back. The manor was still dressed for a wedding. She walked through all of it. The flower arrangements that filled every corridor, white and pale gold and soft green. The kind of arrangement that took 3 days and cost more than most families earned in a year. The silver candlesticks on every surface. The good china laid out in the dining room. The small hand-lettered place cards with family names in careful script. She walked past all of it. She walked past Mr. Pemberton, who stared at her traveling case with an expression of complete and total incomprehension. She walked past 2 housemaids who flattened themselves against the wall, eyes wide. She walked past the front doors and out into the courtyard, where her carriage was already waiting. She had quietly requested it at dawn, that small act of practical preparation, that small private admission to herself that she already knew how this morning might end. The coachman looked at her gown. He looked at the traveling case. He said nothing. He simply stepped down and opened the door. Charlotte climbed in. She looked back at the manor only once, at the perfect pale stone face of it, the rows of windows and the grand entrance and the climbing roses they had planted together along the east wall 2 springs ago, because she had said she loved climbing roses, and he had agreed, and that afternoon in the garden had been the kind of afternoon she had held on to when everything else felt uncertain. She looked at all of it. Then she sat back, and the coachman closed the door, and the carriage began to move. The news reached society before she had even arrived at Willowmere. A duke's wedding called off. The bride walked out. By evening, every drawing room in the county was alive with variations of the story, each one more creative than the last. She had gone mad. She had revealed some scandal. She had been found unsuitable at the final hour by the Duke himself and told to leave. Nobody, not once in any version she later heard about, considered the simplest truth that Charlotte Everly had simply refused to be small. That she had looked at the ring on her finger and the man across the desk and made a clear-eyed calculation about the cost of what was being asked of her, and decided the price was too high. In the carriage, Charlotte pressed her bare left hand flat against the fabric of her skirt. She felt the absence of the ring, the particular lightness of a removed weight, the way your hand feels strange, and then strangely free. She looked out at the road ahead. The morning was clear. The road was long. And for the first time in a very long time, the woman in the ivory gown felt not safe, not certain, not any of the things she had tried so hard to feel for 3 years, but herself. Entirely, completely, and for the first time in years, unreservedly herself. And that she decided as Ashford Manor disappeared behind the curve of the road was something no ring had ever given her. The carriage arrived at Willowmere House just before noon. Charlotte had not been back in 2 years. She stepped out of the carriage, still wearing the wedding gown. She had not thought to bring a change of clothing, or rather, she had not allowed herself to think that far ahead, because thinking that far ahead would have required her to fully accept what she was doing before she had the courage to do it. So she stepped out onto the gravel drive in ivory silk, with her hair half unpinned, and her traveling case in her hand, and she stood in front of the house. Her grandmother had left her, and she breathed. The house breathed back. It was not beautiful. Not anymore, if it ever had been. The paint on the front door was peeling at the bottom corners. One of the shutters on the upper left window hung at an angle, never fully repaired after a winter storm 3 years ago. The garden, which had once been something her grandmother described with quiet pride, was overgrown in the way of things that have been left too long without anyone paying attention. Charlotte looked at all of it. She said all right and to nobody in particular, and she went inside. Mrs. Hooper, who had been caretaking the property for the past 18 months with minimal support and even less guidance from the absent owner, opened the door before Charlotte reached it. The woman was 60, broad-shouldered, with the permanent expression of someone who had encountered most varieties of human trouble and was rarely surprised by new ones. She looked at Charlotte. She looked at the gown. She looked at the missing ring finger. She said, "I'll put the kettle on." "Thank you," Charlotte said. "And I'll need a room that isn't the master bedroom." Mrs. Hooper did not ask why. She simply led Charlotte upstairs to the small blue room that had been Charlotte's as a child, the one with the window facing east and the slightly uneven floorboard just inside the door that announced every entrance with a small moan of wood. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed. She heard the floorboard speak as Mrs. Hooper left. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry. She had decided on the carriage ride, not consciously, not with any dramatic resolution, simply decided the way a person decides to stop pressing a bruise, that grief was not the first thing she owed herself. There would be time for grief. There would be time for all the complicated emotions that were waiting in their proper order, patient and heavy at the back of her chest. First, there was the practical matter of living. She changed out of the wedding gown herself, folding it with more care than she felt like giving it and placing it in the bottom of the wardrobe. She found an old day dress at the back of the closet, slightly too large around the waist, now faded at the collar, but clean and solid, and hers in a way the silk had not quite been. She put it on and stood in front of the small mirror above the dresser and looked at her own face. The scar. She pressed her fingertip to it gently. Felt the slight ridging of the healed skin. Felt absolutely nothing she had not already known. "There you are," she said quietly to her reflection. Not to the scar, to herself. Then she went downstairs and drank her tea and began the work of understanding what she had inherited. The estate accounts were a disaster, not a dramatic disaster, not the kind with a villain and stolen funds and a moment of shocking revelation. The kind of disaster that happens when a property is simply not attended to slow, quiet grinding. Bills slightly behind. Agreements slightly outdated. Income slightly less than outgoing in a dozen small ways that added up to something genuinely dangerous over time. Charlotte sat with the accounts ledger at the kitchen table that first evening and read every entry. Mrs. Hooper sat across from her mending a curtain hem, and occasionally Charlotte would say something like, "What is this payment to Gorton and Sons?" And Mrs. Hooper would say something like, "The man who keeps pretending to fix the roof." And Charlotte would write a small note in the margin and move on. By midnight, she had read 4 years of accounts and had a very clear picture of the problem. The property could support itself barely, and only if it was managed with actual attention. It had not received actual attention. It had received the minimum required to keep it from collapsing immediately, which meant it had been collapsing slowly instead. "This can be corrected," Charlotte said. "Can it?" said Mrs. Hooper, who did not look up from her mending. "Yes, it requires decisions and consistency, and someone actually being present to make both." Charlotte closed the ledger. "I am present now." Mrs. Hooper looked up at her then. A long look. The look of a woman assessing a claim before deciding whether to believe it. "You're staying," she said. "I'm staying." Another long look. Then, the Hartley family over the East Field. They've been waiting 8 months for someone to resolve a boundary dispute with the Godwin farm. I've written to the solicitor twice. "I'll see the Hartley family tomorrow," Charlotte said. Mrs. Hooper nodded once. She returned to her mending. And there was something in that single nod that Charlotte felt more distinctly than she had felt almost anything in the past 12 hours, a small, solid vote of confidence from a woman who did not give them easily. She slept that night in the blue room with the east-facing window, and she did not dream about the wedding. And she woke before 6 to the sound of birds making an entirely unreasonable amount of noise, and she lay there for a moment in the pale morning light and thought, "This is mine. This actual imperfect, neglected possible place is mine, and I am going to make something of it." Then she got up and started. The Hartley boundary dispute was resolved in 3 visits and 1 firmly written letter. It was not complicated. It had simply never been addressed by anyone with the willingness and the legal standing to address it. Charlotte read the original land agreements, identified the relevant clause that had been misread deliberately, she suspected by the Godwin farm's overseer, and wrote a letter to the Godwin family's solicitor that was so precise and so unapologetically correct that the matter was settled within a fortnight. Word traveled fast in small communities. By the following week, a widow named Mrs. Fenn came to the kitchen door with a question about a rental agreement she had signed after her husband's death. An agreement that Charlotte read in 4 minutes and identified as containing a clause that had not been disclosed to Mrs. Fenn at signing. Charlotte helped her draft a response. The rental agency, faced with a woman who clearly understood what she had signed, quietly revised the terms. Then there was Tom Carver, whose family had worked the same parcel of land for 3 generations, and who had received a notice that their tenancy agreement was being reviewed, the sort of notice that was not quite a threat, but was designed to feel like one. Charlotte read the notice. Then she read the original tenancy. Then she sat down with Tom Carver at the same kitchen table where she had read the accounts on her first night, and she explained exactly what he was entitled to, and exactly what the landowner was and was not legally permitted to do, and exactly what words Tom should say if anyone came to pressure him again. Tom Carver was 53 years old. He had been worried for 6 months. By the time he left Charlotte's kitchen, he looked like a man who had put down a weight he had forgotten he was carrying. "How does she know all this?" Charlotte heard him ask Mrs. Hooper in the hall. "She reads," Mrs. Hooper said simply. Charlotte smiled at the table. She did not have a legal degree. She did not have formal training. What she had was a habit developed over years of being underestimated, of reading everything thoroughly, because the only reliable defense against being taken advantage of was understanding exactly what was written on the page in front of you. She had learned that the hard way. She decided it was something other people should not have to learn alone. What nobody told Charlotte, what she had not prepared herself for, was how much the work would cost her emotionally in the beginning. Not the estate work, the other kind. The visits to tenant cottages, where she saw how people lived when nobody powerful paid attention. The elderly woman in the 3rd cottage from the mill, whose firewood allocation had been quietly reduced over 3 winters without anyone formally acknowledging it. The young family in the north end of the village, who had 3 children and an agreement that entitled them to a repair on their water supply that had simply never been made. Charlotte sat with these people and listened to them describe their situations with the careful, practiced restraint of people who had learned that complaining too loudly only made their lives harder. They were not dramatic about their troubles. They were matter of fact. They presented problems the way people present problems they have given up expecting to be solved. That was the thing that stayed with her at night. Not the problems. The resignation. She lay in the blue room, listening to the early summer sounds outside the window, and she thought about how many people had been told in one way or another for so long that their concerns did not merit proper attention until they stopped expecting it. until they started presenting their own suffering in apologetic pre-minimized terms, the way she herself had learned to do. The way she had done in Alexander's library. The way she had almost done on the morning of the wedding, when she had stood in front of her mirror and thought, perhaps he is right. Perhaps the scar is too much. Perhaps I should simply... She pressed her face into the pillow and refused to finish that thought. She was done finishing that thought. 3 weeks after Charlotte left Ashford Manor, a letter arrived. She recognized Alexander's handwriting on the outside of the envelope, the careful, slightly forward-leaning script she had read dozens of times. She held the envelope for a long moment without opening it. She set it on the desk. She walked away from it. She went back to it. She opened it. Charlotte, I have rewritten this letter 11 times. I want you to know that before you read a single word of it, because I want you to understand that whatever the final version looks like, it required 11 attempts to reach even this level of coherence, and that imperfection is perhaps the most honest thing I can offer you at this moment. I am not writing to ask you to return. I am writing because several weeks have passed, and I have spent them in the particular company of a man I did not particularly like, which is to say myself, without the comfortable fictions I usually maintain about my own character. It has not been pleasant. I said that I was asking you to cover the scar for your comfort. That was not true. It was a lie I told myself so efficiently that I almost believed it. I was asking you to cover it for mine. For the comfort of not having to stand in front of 400 people who know my family name and navigate whatever they thought when they looked at you. Which tells you something about me that I am not proud of. I cannot explain why I failed so completely at the moment that mattered most. I can only tell you that the sound of you leaving that sound is something I hear in every quiet room. I am not asking for anything. I only wanted you to know that I understand now what you meant when you said I should know what I was sorry for. I know. Alexander. Charlotte read the letter twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she put it in the drawer of the desk and closed it, and she went back to the accounts ledger, and she did not reply. Not that day. Not that week. Not because she was punishing him, and not because she didn't feel anything. She felt a great deal painfully, every line of it, but because feeling something about a person and being ready to re-enter their orbit were two entirely different things, and she had spent enough of her life confusing them. She was not ready. She was not certain she would ever be. What she was busy. Productively, meaningfully, bone-tiringly busy. And for now, that was enough. The second letter arrived 6 weeks after the first. This one was not from Alexander. It was from Lady Hargrove. Margaret Hargrove, who was 61 years old, who had been a fixture of county society for 40 years, who was known for having the most precise social memory in 3 counties and the sharpest tongue to match, and who had never in Charlotte's experience written to her directly about anything. Charlotte almost didn't open it. She opened it. Miss Everly, you do not know me well, which is your good fortune, as I am not universally considered pleasant company. I am writing to you because I have heard from 3 separate sources about the work you have been doing for the families around Willowmere, and because I am old enough to say plainly what younger people feel they must approach sideways. You are wasting your abilities in isolation. I am not complimenting you. I am stating a fact as I would state that rain is wasted on pavement. The people you are helping in your kitchen and at your kitchen table deserve more than informal assistance from a woman without formal backing. And you deserve a context in which what you do is recognized rather than whispered about. I run a small fund privately, without society's involvement, because society would ruin it, that supports women in legal and financial difficulty. We have been doing this quietly for 11 years. We need someone with your particular combination of skills and stubbornness. Come to tea on Thursday if you are interested. If you are not, don't. I have no patience for people who come to meetings out of politeness. Margaret Hargrove. Charlotte read the letter once. Then she laughed, a real short, startled laugh that surprised even her, because the letter was so entirely itself, so aggressively uninterested in being charming, that it was somehow the most refreshing thing she had read in months. She wrote back the same afternoon. Lady Hargrove. Thursday at 3 if that suits. I will not come out of politeness. Charlotte Everly. Margaret Hargrove's house smelled of old books and strong tea, and a very confident dog who immediately placed his head on Charlotte's knee and refused to move. Lady Hargrove herself was seated at a writing desk covered in papers and showed no sign of having organized anything deliberately. She looked exactly like her letter, precise, slightly impatient, and entirely unbothered by what anyone thought of that. "Sit," she said. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Charlotte sat. "You read law," Lady Hargrove said, "without formal training." "I read everything," Charlotte said. "Law in particular, because people seem to expect me not to." Lady Hargrove looked at her over the rim of her glasses. Something in her expression shifted a slight narrowing, the kind that meant she was actually paying attention, rather than simply waiting. "The Whitmore engagement," she said. Charlotte held steady. "Yes. He asked you to cover the scar." It landed with the bluntness of a stone dropped on a table. Charlotte had been bracing for the delicate version of it, the careful social navigation, the implication rather than the statement. She was not bracing for directness, and so directness caught her off guard. "Yes," she said. "And you left." "I did." "Good," said Lady Hargrove. Charlotte blinked. "I beg your pardon. I said good." Lady Hargrove picked up her tea. "I have known Alexander Whitmore since he was 12 years old. He has excellent qualities and a significant blind spot, which is a dangerous combination in a man of his position. You were right to leave. He needed to understand something, and he was not going to understand it while you were still there making things comfortable." She set her cup down. "That said, you are not here because of him. You are here because of what you did after." "The tenancy work," Charlotte said. "The tenancy work, the widow, the Hartley matter, and 3 other situations I know about that you apparently resolved without mentioning to anyone." Lady Hargrove fixed her with a look. "You are systematic. You do not work for gratitude, and you do not minimize what you find in order to make other people comfortable." "No," Charlotte said. "I have recently retired from that particular occupation." Something crossed Lady Hargrove's face. It might have been amusement. It moved through quickly. "We have 12 women currently in active need of assistance," she said. "Property disputes, inheritance challenges, unfair agreements, one matter involving a husband's debts being improperly claimed against assets that were legally hers. We have a solicitor who advises us 2 afternoons a month and a fund that covers costs when needed." She looked at Charlotte directly. "What I do not have is someone willing to sit with the women themselves, to read their documents, to explain in plain language what they are dealing with and what options exist, to be the first person in the process, the person who makes it possible to reach the solicitor at all." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "You're describing something between a caseworker and an advocate," she said. "I'm describing you," Lady Hargrove said simply. "The question is whether you agree." Charlotte thought about Mrs. Fenn and her rental agreement, Tom Carver and his tenancy notice. The look on the elderly woman's face when Charlotte had simply sat down across from her and said, "Tell me the whole story from the beginning, and don't leave anything out because you think it's unimportant." The look of someone who had been waiting to be heard and had mostly given up expecting it. "I agree," Charlotte said. Lady Hargrove nodded once briskly, the way people nod when they have received the answer they expected, but were not taking for granted. "Thursday afternoons," she said. "You will meet with the women here in this room. I will be present for the first month, and then you will work independently. The solicitor's name is Mr. Fallow. He is not particularly warm, but he is very good, and he respects people who have done their reading." She paused. "He will respect you." "I'll make sure of it," Charlotte said. And for the first time in a long time, for the first time really since she had climbed into a carriage in a wedding gown with a traveling case and no particular plan, Charlotte felt something click into place. Not everything. Not a resolution or a happy ending, or even a clear path forward. Just a piece. A real one. The feeling of a person finding in the rubble of the life she had demolished one very good and very solid brick. She drove home with her hands light on her lap, and her mind already running through the 12 cases Lady Hargrove had described, ranking them by urgency, thinking about what documents she would need to request and what questions she would need to ask. Mrs. Hooper met her at the door. "How was it?" she asked. "Useful," Charlotte said. "Genuinely, specifically useful." She handed Mrs. Hooper her coat. "I'll need the small desk in the front room cleared. I'm going to need a proper workspace." Mrs. Hooper took the coat. She looked at Charlotte with the same long assessing look as the first night. Then she said, "I'll clear it tonight." What Charlotte did not know, what she was not watching, because she had made a deliberate decision not to, was what was happening at Ashford Manor in the weeks after she left. Alexander had not recovered easily. He had expected in the first days that the practical weight of managing the estate would absorb him, that there would simply be too much to do for the particular kind of thinking that led nowhere good. He was wrong about that. The estate ran. Things happened. People came and went. He signed papers and attended to matters, and on the surface, nothing changed. Underneath, everything was different. It was the smallest things. He would be in the library, and he would reach automatically for a second cup, because for 3 years he had always poured 2. Always had a second cup, ready for Charlotte when she was there, and after she left, he kept doing it, the motion, so built into his body, that he had poured and set down an unwanted cup 3 times before he understood what he was doing. He would ride the east boundary of the estate, something he had always done alone before Charlotte, and find himself stopping at the places she had always stopped. The gap in the hedgerow where you could see the valley. The old oak that had been struck by lightning 20 years ago, and half of it had died, and half of it had stubbornly continued to grow. She had loved that tree. She had said once that she found it comforting that a thing could be partially broken and still be alive. He had not understood what she meant then. He understood now. He stood at the oak for a long time on a Thursday afternoon in early summer, and understood so many things he had failed to understand when it would have mattered. But it was the estate accounts that undid him. He had given the spring reviews only partial attention, not negligently. He told himself, but efficiently, with the confidence of a man who believed his estate was well managed because it had always appeared well managed. He gave the summer review his full attention. He brought in the full ledgers. He spent 3 days reading everything. And what he found should have surprised him. It didn't. Because Charlotte had been trying to tell him. For 2 years, she had flagged concerns, always gently, always framed as questions rather than criticisms, always in the careful way of a woman who had learned to present her observations in packaging a man's pride could receive without activating his defenses. She had said, "Have you considered the Barton Agreement? I thought some of the terms seemed unfavorable." She had said, "The Northfield drainage issue, it's a small matter now, but I wonder if it might become something larger." She had said once, almost as an aside, "Sitting in this very library, your estate manager seems like a capable man, but I notice the accounts from the Eastern Holdings rarely appear in full in the quarterly reviews. Is that normal?" He had said, "Charlotte, I appreciate your interest, but the estate management is well in hand." He had said that. He sat now at his desk, with the full Eastern Holdings accounts spread in front of him, the ones his estate manager had been submitting as summaries, the ones Charlotte had asked about, the ones that showed in careful and damning detail 3 years of decisions that were either deeply incompetent or something considerably less innocent. And he felt the particular quality of shame that only arrives when a person understands not just that they were wrong, but how thoroughly they were warned. She had told him. She had told him in her precise, careful, gentle way, and he had patted the information away and gone back to managing appearances. He sat with that for a very long time. Then he did something he had never done before. He wrote a letter, not to his solicitor, not to his estate manager, not to any of the men who usually received his communications, but to his head tenant, a man named Daniel Holt, who had worked the largest farm on the estate for 15 years, and asked directly for an honest accounting of how things stood. Daniel Holt's response arrived 4 days later. It was 7 pages long. It began, "Your Grace, I appreciate you asking. No one has asked before, and there are things I have been hoping to tell someone for quite some time." Alexander read all 7 pages. He read them like a man reading a verdict. And when he finished, he sat in his library, the same library where Charlotte had placed his ring on the desk, and said, "I won't hide who I am." and he understood with the full weight of adult clarity that he had built his life on an extremely convincing performance of control, and that Charlotte Everly had seen through it years before he did, and that he had responded to being truly seen by asking her to cover her face. He put his head in his hands. He stayed that way for a while. Then he stood up and opened the ledger and began the very long work of learning what he actually had instead of what he had been told. Outside his library window, summer moved forward. In a house 20 miles away, a woman in a faded day dress sat at a cleared desk in a front room, reading a stranger's lease agreement with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the words on the page could change a life. She did not think about him. She thought about the words, and page by page, case by case, day by day. Charlotte Everly built a life that needed nothing added to be complete. That was the thing that society never saw coming. They had expected her to wait. They had expected her to diminish. They had expected, as people always expect of women who make dramatic exits, that the drama was the point, and the aftermath would be quiet and apologetic and small. Charlotte Everly was none of those things, and the woman who was emerging from the ruins of an almost wedding was beginning slowly, imperfectly. One case and one letter and one person listened to at a time, to look nothing like the woman who had spent 3 years making herself palatable enough to stand beside a duke. She looked like herself, and herself, it turned out, was more than enough. The letter from Alexander's solicitor arrived on a Wednesday morning in late August, and Charlotte almost missed it entirely because she was in the middle of a heated argument with a man who did not want to be argued with. His name was Gerald Foss. He was 44, red-faced, the kind of man who had spent his entire life being agreed with by people who needed something from him. He was the rental agent whose company had tried to quietly revise the terms on Mrs. Fenn's agreement 3 months ago, the matter Charlotte had helped resolve. Now he was back standing in the front room of Willowmere House, and he was not pleased. "You have no legal standing to involve yourself in these matters," he said. "I am advising private individuals on agreements they have already signed," Charlotte said. She did not look up from the document in front of her. "That requires no legal standing whatsoever. You are creating trouble. I am reading contracts." She looked up then levelly. "Is there something in the contracts you would prefer remained unread?" Foss's face went a darker shade of red. "I will be speaking to Lady Hargrove about this." "Lady Hargrove's Thursday afternoons are by appointment," Charlotte said. "I will let her know to expect your correspondence." She folded the document she had been reviewing and set it neatly on the corner of the desk. "Is there anything else, Mr. Foss?" He left without answering. Charlotte watched him go, listened to the front door close with more force than was strictly necessary, and then breathed out slowly through her nose. Mrs. Hooper appeared in the doorway, holding the day's post. "Gerald Foss," she said. "Gerald Foss," Charlotte confirmed. "He'll be back." "I know." Charlotte accepted the stack of letters. "I'll be ready." She sorted through the post quickly. 2 letters from women. Lady Hargrove had referred to her one from the solicitor Mr. Fallow, with notes on the property dispute she had been preparing, and then at the bottom of the stack, an envelope she did not immediately recognize. The return address was not Ashford Manor. It was a London address, a law firm she did not know. She opened it. It was not from Alexander. It was from a man named Percival Crane, senior partner of Crane and Associates, writing on behalf of a client he did not name, requesting a meeting at Charlotte's earliest convenience regarding a matter of some delicacy related to the Willowmere estate. Charlotte read it twice. Then she read it a third time more slowly. She had enough experience now with letters that said less than they meant to understand that this one was constructed very carefully. A matter of some delicacy was the kind of phrase used by people who wanted to make something sound significant without specifying what it was. On behalf of a client was the phrase used when the person with actual power did not yet want to show their hand. She set it on the desk. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon while she worked through 2 other cases, and she was still thinking about it that evening when she sat at the kitchen table across from Mrs. Hooper and said without preamble, "Someone is looking into Willowmere." Mrs. Hooper looked up from her mending. "What kind of looking?" "The legal kind, through a London firm." Charlotte pressed her finger to the letter. "Someone with money. Someone who doesn't want to be named yet. Could be anyone. It could be, Charlotte agreed. But Willowmere has not attracted legal attention of any kind for 20 years. I have been here 4 months. I have resolved 3 property disputes, assisted 14 families, and made Gerald Foss very unhappy. She looked at Mrs. Hooper. Someone has noticed. Is that a problem? Mrs. Hooper asked. Charlotte considered. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I intend to find out. She wrote back to Percival Crane that night. She agreed to a meeting. She set the time and location, not London, not on his ground at Willowmere House in the front room on a Friday at 10 in the morning. Her desk, her house, her terms. She did not sleep particularly well. 3 days before the meeting with Crane, Charlotte received a visitor she had not expected. Not Alexander, not yet. His younger sister. Viola Whitmore arrived without announcement, which was consistent with everything Charlotte had ever known about Viola. A woman of 23 who found formality useful only when she was deploying it strategically, and who had apparently decided this was not a strategic occasion. She appeared at the Willowmere front door at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a riding habit and carrying nothing except the directness of someone who had made a decision and was not interested in being talked out of it. Charlotte opened the door herself. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Viola spoke first. You look better, she said. Honestly, better than I expected. Come in, Charlotte said. They sat in the kitchen, which was Charlotte had found the only room in the house where real conversations happened naturally. Mrs. Hooper made tea with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood the kitchen's particular function, and then left with a discretion that Charlotte had come to rely on. Viola wrapped both hands around her cup. She looked at the scar on Charlotte's face with the directness of someone who had decided not to pretend she wasn't looking. Does it hurt? She asked. No, Charlotte said. It hasn't in months. Good. Viola set her cup down. Charlotte, I want you to know I argued with him. That morning, before he went to you. I told him it was wrong. Charlotte was still. You knew what he was planning to ask. He didn't tell me directly, but I heard him talking to Pemberton about cosmetic arrangements, about how the ceremony would appear, and I knew what it meant. Viola's jaw tightened. I went to him. I said, Alexander, if you walk in there and say what I think you are about to say, you will lose her. And he... She stopped. What did he say? He said I was being dramatic. Viola's voice was flat. He said I was too young to understand how social presentation functions in a ducal household. Charlotte absorbed that. The particular quality of it, the way he had dismissed Viola's warning, the same way he had dismissed her own instincts, the same way he had dismissed Daniel Holt's 7 pages, the same way he had dismissed Charlotte's questions about the estate accounts. A pattern she could now see fully because she was far enough away from it to look at the whole shape. He was wrong about that too, Charlotte said quietly. Yes, Viola said. He was. She looked at Charlotte directly. I am not here because he asked me to come. He doesn't know I'm here. I came because you were kind to me, Charlotte. For 3 years you were kind to me in a house where people are very polished but not always kind. And I wanted to say that to your face. She paused. And to ask if you are all right. Not if you are managing. Not if you are coping. Actually all right. Charlotte looked at this young woman, 23 years old, brave enough to ride 20 miles without telling her brother, honest enough to ask the question nobody else had asked quite that directly. Yes, Charlotte said. And it was true. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but yes. She looked in at her own hands on the table. I am doing work that matters. I am sleeping in a room I chose. I am making decisions without asking anyone's permission first. She looked up. I think more all right than I have been in several years. Viola was quiet for a moment. Then, he's different, you know, since you left. Charlotte did not respond. I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty, Viola added quickly. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think you should know it. He's been going through the estate accounts himself personally, for the first time in his life. He let go of the estate manager Mr. Holt wrote to him and... She stopped again. Did you know about the estate manager? I suspected something, Charlotte said carefully. I was misrepresenting the accounts for 3 years. Viola's voice lowered. When Alexander found it, he sat in the library for an entire evening without speaking to anyone. Pemberton said he'd never seen him like that. She looked at Charlotte. He was not angry. That was the strange part. He was just very, very quiet. Charlotte thought about that kind of quiet. The quiet of a person who has discovered that a story they told themselves about their own life was not accurate and is now reviewing everything else in the story to see what else is wrong. She knew that quiet well. She had spent several weeks in it herself. Viola, she said, I am not going to tell you what I feel about your brother because I am not entirely sure what I feel about your brother, and in any case, it is not something I can give you to take back to him. She folded her hands on the table. What I will tell you is this. I hope he finds what he is looking for. I genuinely mean that. The man I loved for 3 years was real. Whatever he is becoming now may be real too. But I cannot be the reason he becomes it. Do you understand the difference? Viola looked at her for a long time. Then she said quietly, Yes. Good. You are wiser than people gave you credit for, Viola said. Most women are, Charlotte said simply. Viola left an hour later, and Charlotte stood at the front window and watched her ride away, and felt the complicated weight of the conversation settle slowly in her chest. Not grief, not regret, but something more textured than either. A recognition that the situation was alive and moving, even when she wasn't looking at it. That Alexander was somewhere 20 miles away, becoming someone she had not yet met. And that she was here also becoming someone she had not yet fully met. And that those two processes were happening simultaneously, without reference to each other, and the distance between them was either growing or narrowing in ways she could not yet see. She did not know which she wanted. She turned away from the window and went back to work. Percival Crane was exactly what his letter suggested. Careful, well-dressed, with the practiced smoothness of a man who delivered difficult news for a living, and had learned to do it without any apparent awareness that it was difficult. He sat across from Charlotte in the front room on a Friday morning, and placed a thin folder on the desk between them, and said, I appreciate your flexibility in meeting me here, Miss Everly. Mr. Crane, Charlotte said pleasantly, please tell me who you represent. A slight pause. I am not at liberty. You've come to my home, Charlotte said. About my estate. If you expect me to respond to whatever you are about to say, I will need to know who is saying it. Another pause. Longer. Then, Lord Aldwyn Beckford. Charlotte kept her expression neutral. Lord Beckford. She knew the name. Everyone in the county knew the name. He was 67, widowed, the owner of the largest consolidated land holdings in the region, including, she now recalled with a clarity that arrived like cold water, the land that bordered Willowmere on the north and east sides. And what does Lord Beckford want? She asked. I is prepared to offer a very generous purchase price for the Willowmere estate, Crane said. He opened the folder and slid a single page across the desk. As you will see, the figure is substantially above market value. Lord Beckford is aware that the property has required significant investment and that the situation may present certain challenges for an unattached... Stop there, Charlotte said. Crane stopped. The word you are looking for, Charlotte said, is not unattached. The word is woman. Lord Beckford believes that a woman managing a rural estate alone will be at some point persuadable. He is preempting that moment with a generous offer before I become more trouble than I am worth. She looked at the page without picking it up. How am I doing so far? Crane's smoothness, to his credit, did not entirely desert him, but it slipped slightly. Lord Beckford has a great deal of respect for your... I am not selling Willowmere, Charlotte said. Miss Everly, if you would simply review the terms. I have reviewed the figure. She pushed the page back across the desk. It is generous. It is also irrelevant. She folded her hands on the desk. Lord Beckford's eastern fields have been using the drainage channel that runs through the northern corner of this estate for 11 years. The original agreement that permitted that use lapsed 9 years ago and was never renewed. I discovered this in the accounts 3 months ago. I have not acted on it because I was deciding whether it was worth my time. She looked at Crane steadily. "Tell Lord Beckford that I would be happy to discuss a revised drainage agreement at a fair market rate for continued access. Tell him also that I am not selling. And tell him that if he sends anyone else to this house with a purchase offer, I will begin enforcement proceedings on the drainage issue immediately." Crane looked at her. He was reassessing something visibly. Not offensively, simply the reassessment that happens when a situation is not what you walked into it expecting. "I will relay your response," he said. "Thank you," Charlotte said. "Mrs. Hooper will see you out." When he was gone, Charlotte sat at her desk for a long moment without moving. Her heart was beating faster than she wanted it to. Not from fear. From the particular adrenaline of a confrontation that went the way it needed to go, not the way that felt comfortable, but the way that was right. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. She said quietly to the empty room, "All right, next." The Beckford approach had a consequence Charlotte had not fully anticipated. It became known. Not through Crane, he was professional enough. But in small communities, things become known through the texture of daily life. The changed quality of how people spoke to you in the market or at church. The slight adjustment of posture in people who had been watching to see which way something was going to fall. People had been watching Charlotte. She understood that now. She had been for 4 months an interesting problem for the county to solve. The woman who refused a duke, living alone at a neglected estate, helping tenant farmers and widows with their contracts. People had been waiting to see whether she would fail quietly or fail loudly, because those were the only outcomes most of them had considered. She had not failed. And now, Lord Beckford, a man of significantly greater property than even Alexander Whitmore, had sent a London solicitor to buy her out, and she had sent him back empty-handed, and the county was rapidly revising its model of Charlotte Everly. The first indication was Daniel Morse. How was a solicitor in the nearby town? A respectable, cautious man who had been practicing for 20 years and had never once sought Charlotte's acquaintance. He appeared at Willowmere on a Tuesday afternoon and said with the slight discomfort of a man doing something outside his established habits that he had heard about the Beckford drainage issue, and that he thought she might benefit from a formal legal review of her property boundaries and agreements. "I can offer 2 afternoons a month," he said, "at reduced rate." Charlotte looked at him. "Why?" He looked slightly startled. "I beg your pardon. Why are you offering this now?" she asked. Not confrontationally. She genuinely wanted to know. 3 months ago, you had no interest in my existence." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I was waiting to see whether you intended to stay. And now you believe I do." "I believe you are not going anywhere," he said. "And I believe that what you are building here is going to require proper legal support before very long, and I would rather be involved from the beginning than arrive late." Charlotte considered him. He was being honest, not generously honest, not heroically honest, but practically honest. He was a man who had assessed a situation and made a reasonable decision based on the assessment. She could respect that. "Monday mornings," she said. "Not afternoon. I need afternoons for the women's work. Monday mornings, 7 to 9 before your other appointments." He blinked. 7 in the morning. "I am at my desk at 6, Charlotte said. 7 is generous." He came on Monday morning. He came every Monday morning after that. It was during the 3rd Monday session with Daniel Morse that Charlotte discovered the thing she had not been looking for, and could not once she had found it unknown. They had been reviewing the land parcel records. The full historical documents, the ones that lived in the bottom drawer of the estate desk and had not been opened in years. Morse was efficient and thorough, and he pulled each file and reviewed it with practiced speed, and Charlotte sat across from him taking notes. Then he opened one particular file and went quiet. Not briefly quiet. The long considered quiet of someone reading something they need to read twice. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. He did not answer immediately. He kept reading. "Mr. Morse." He looked up. "Miss Everly," he said, and his voice had changed, careful now, with the particular careful of someone walking on ice they were not certain would hold. "What do you know about the original Willowmere land grant?" "Not much," she admitted. "My grandmother inherited it from her father. She never spoke about the original grant specifically." "Your grandmother's father," Morse said slowly, Was Benjamin Hartwell. Yes. Benjamin Hartwell, Morse said, was the original grantee of a parcel of land that included not just the current Willowmere boundaries. He turned the file toward her. But this entire section here. He placed his finger on a map drawn in faded ink, which is now the eastern portion of the Beckford estate. The room went very still. Charlotte looked at the map, at the boundary lines drawn in a century-old hand, at the notation at the bottom of the page, a clause she could not read quickly enough, her eyes moving too fast over the unfamiliar script. "Explain it to me," she said. Her voice was very quiet. Morse took a breath. This was a conditional land grant. The original parcel, which was significantly larger than your current holdings, was awarded to Benjamin Hartwell with a provision. Specifically, that in the event of certain conditions, he turned the page, the land would revert to the original grant boundaries. Or to put it plainly, the land that became the Beckford Eastern Fields may not have been legally transferable. Charlotte looked at him. "Are you saying," she said carefully, "that Lord Beckford's Eastern Fields may not legally belong to Lord Beckford?" Morse pressed his lips together. "I am saying that this document raises a question that requires very thorough examination by someone considerably more specialized than myself." He looked at her steadily. "I am also saying that Lord Beckford's solicitor came here last week with a purchase offer, and that Lord Beckford has been acquiring land in this region for 30 years with significant aggression and very little apparent interest in what anyone else thought about it." Charlotte sat back. She thought about Crane sitting across from her in this same room. The folder, the figure, the generous offer, the careful mention of her being unattached, that specific word, which now felt less like condescension and more like something else. Something like urgency. Something like a man who needed her to agree to something before she had time to read everything in the bottom drawer. "He knew," Charlotte said. "Not a question." "I cannot say that," Morse said carefully. "But he knew," Charlotte said again, "or he suspected, and he wanted me out before I found it." Morse looked at her for a long moment. "I think," he said, "that you should write to Lady Hargrove today, and I think we should retain a London specialist, and I think—" He paused with the expression of a cautious man arriving at an incautious conclusion. "I think you should be very careful, Miss Everly. Men like Beckford do not lose gracefully." Charlotte thought about Gerald Foss and his red face. She thought about Crane and his careful folder. She thought about the weight of a county full of people who had been waiting to see which way she would fall. She thought about a morning in a wedding dress when she had decided she was done being small. "I know," she said. "I've been learning that lesson for some time." She wrote to Lady Hargrove that afternoon. The letter was 4 pages long and precise, and left nothing out. Lady Hargrove's reply arrived the following morning. It was 3 sentences. "Good God. Come Thursday first thing, not at 3. Bring the documents." Charlotte brought the documents. Lady Hargrove read them with the same focused silence she brought to everything, and Charlotte sat across from her, and did not rush, and watched the old woman's face move through a sequence of expressions, controlled, surprise, careful calculation, and then something that on another person might have been described as excitement, but on Lady Hargrove presented as a very particular sharpening of the eyes. "You understand what this means," Lady Hargrove said. "I understand what it might mean," Charlotte said. "I understand that it requires a specialist to confirm. I understand that Beckford will fight it, and that he has significantly more resources than I do, and that this will be a long and unpleasant process if it goes forward." She looked at Lady Hargrove steadily. "I also understand that if the document means what Mr. Morse believes it means, there are families living on that land whose agreements were made with a party who may not have had the legal standing to make them." Lady Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "You are thinking about the tenants." "I am thinking about everyone," Charlotte said, "including the tenants." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "Lady Hargrove, I need to ask you something directly. What I am describing pursuing this is not small. It is not a widow's rental agreement or a boundary dispute between neighbors. If Beckford's land grant is compromised, that touches every transaction he has made in this region for 30 years. That is—" She stopped, finding the right word, "enormous." "Yes," Lady Hargrove said. "I am 27 years old," Charlotte said. I have no legal training, no title, no husband, and an estate that was quietly falling apart until 5 months ago. Against me is a man who has spent 30 years accumulating power and land and influence. She looked directly at the older woman. Am I being naive to think I can do this? Lady Hargrove looked at her for a long time. Then she said, 3 months ago, Gerald Foss came to see me. He was very angry. He said that a woman at Willowmere was interfering in matters that did not concern her, and that someone should do something about it. She picked up her tea. I asked him what matters she had interfered in. He told me. Then I told him that the matters were exactly the ones that concerned her most, and that his anger told me she was doing her job correctly, and that he should leave before I lost my patience. She set the cup down. Then I asked Daniel Morse very quietly to visit Willowmere on a Monday morning. I wanted someone watching the documents. She looked at Charlotte steadily. I have been building toward this moment, Miss Everly, longer than you have been on the estate. Charlotte stared at her. You knew about the land grant. I suspected something was irregular, Lady Hargrove said carefully. I did not know what. I knew that Beckford's acquisition of those eastern fields was rushed 30 years ago, and that the family who held the land before was pushed rather than persuaded. She paused. I have been waiting for someone with the intelligence and the position and the stubbornness to be in the right place. Charlotte absorbed this. You selected me. I invited you to tea, Lady Hargrove said, which was not technically a denial. Charlotte looked at the woman across from her, 61 years old, with 11 years of quiet work behind her, and the patience of someone who understood that some things could only be built slowly. You might have told me, Charlotte said. You might not have come, Lady Hargrove replied simply. A silence settled between them. And then Charlotte, who had not laughed easily in several months, who had been carrying a great deal of carefully managed emotion for a great deal of carefully managed time, felt something break loose inside her chest. Not grief, not relief. Something that had been wound too tight for too long, finally releasing. She pressed her fist to her mouth. She did not laugh. But she came very close. All right, she said when she had recovered. What do we do next? Lady Hargrove's eyes, sharp and satisfied, and not remotely apologetic, met hers across the desk. We write to London, she said, and we begin. What neither Charlotte nor Lady Hargrove knew as they sat in that room planning the next careful move was that 20 miles away, on the same Thursday morning, Alexander Whitmore had arrived at his own painful crossroads. He had spent the morning reviewing Daniel Holt's accounts, the real ones, not the summaries, and what he found in the Eastern Holdings ledger, cross-referenced with correspondence his now dismissed estate manager had kept, was a reference to a conversation with Lord Beckford's man from 4 years ago. A conversation about Willowmere, about the land boundaries, about whether the Willowmere heir could be persuaded to sell. 4 years ago. Before Charlotte. Before the engagement. Before any of it. Alexander sat at his desk and read the reference 3 times. Someone had been watching Willowmere for 4 years. Someone had been waiting for the estate to reach the condition where its owner could be pressured or purchased, or simply made small enough to remove from the picture. And Charlotte was there now alone, and she did not know. He stood up before he had made any conscious decision. He called for his horse. How was riding before he thought to wonder whether she would want to see him. He rode anyway. Because whatever else was true, whatever she had said, and whatever he had failed to be, and whatever distance she had rightly put between them, Charlotte Everly was 20 miles away, facing something that was bigger than he had understood, and the man he was trying to become did not sit in a library while that was happening. He rode hard. The road was long, and behind him, Ashford Manor grew smaller in the distance, and ahead of him, something he could not yet name, was waiting. He arrived at Willowmere at 11:30. Mrs. Hooper opened the door before he had finished tying his horse, which told him she had heard him coming and had decided in that brief interval to open the door rather than not, a decision he was grateful for, because he had not prepared himself for what he would do if she simply did not let him in. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had formed a complete and not entirely favorable opinion of him and was not concealing it. "She's not here," she said. Alexander felt the specific quality of arriving prepared for a difficult conversation and finding the difficulty had moved. "When will she return?" "Lady Hargroves," Mrs. Hooper said. She studied him for a moment with the calm assessment of someone who had spent a long time watching people and had gotten very accurate at it. "You rode hard. I have information she needs to hear." "What kind of information?" He hesitated. Not because he was unwilling to tell Mrs. Hooper he had the instinct looking at this woman that she knew more about what was happening at Willowmere than most people with twice her social standing, but because he was still arranging it in his own mind into the shape of something speakable. "Beckford," he said. Mrs. Hooper's expression did not change, but something behind it did a sharpening a recognition. "Come in," she said. He came in. She put him in the kitchen, which he understood was not an insult, but a statement about where real things happened in this house, and she put tea in front of him, and he sat at the kitchen table and told her what he had found in the Eastern Holdings correspondence. All of it. The reference to Beckford's man, the conversation 4 years ago, the clear, deliberate patience of a plan that had been waiting for Willowmere to become vulnerable enough to collect. Mrs. Hooper listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "She already knows about Beckford." Alexander stopped. She found the drainage issue 3 months ago. The solicitor Crane visited last week. She sent him back empty-handed. Something in Mrs. Hooper's face shifted the very slight movement of someone who cannot quite suppress a satisfaction. She told him if Beckford sent anyone else, she'd begin enforcement proceedings immediately. Alexander stared at her. "She did that herself." "She does most things herself," Mrs. Hooper said. "She's had good practice." He absorbed that. Sat with the specific reconfiguration. It required the version of events he had ridden 20 miles carrying the urgent rescue he had constructed in his mind on the road, quietly dismantling itself around him. Charlotte was not waiting to be warned. Charlotte had already engaged the threat, named it, and pushed back. Of course she had. He should have known that before he rode. "There's more," he said. "What I found isn't just about the approach to Charlotte. It's about the history. Beckford's man spoke with my estate manager 4 years ago before any of this. They were discussing whether Willowmere could be acquired before Charlotte inherited it outright. Beckford knew about the land grant question even then. He's been managing this situation for years." He looked at Mrs. Hooper. "Charlotte needs to know the scale of it. Not just the drainage issue, the whole thing." Mrs. Hooper was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove it?" "The correspondence is in my estate papers. My estate manager kept records of everything, apparently including conversations he should not have been having. I discovered it this morning in the same review that revealed the extent of his mismanagement." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I came here the moment I understood what it meant." Another long look from Mrs. Hooper, the kind that measured. "She'll be back by 2, she said finally. "I'll wait," Alexander said. Mrs. Hooper looked at him one more time. Then she refilled his tea, which was, he understood, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. The provisional extension of a woman who had not yet decided what he deserved, but was willing to see. Charlotte came through the kitchen door at 10 minutes past 2, with her coat half off and a folder of documents under her arm, and the particular energy of someone who had been in motion for hours and had not yet stopped thinking. She was talking over her shoulder to someone he heard her say, "Monday without fail, tell him I will not reschedule." And then she turned and stopped. She looked at him. He stood up. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The kitchen held the particular charged silence of a room where two people are very conscious of each other's presence and are taking a second to acknowledge that to themselves before deciding what to do with it. Charlotte looked different. He had been expecting that on some level, but the reality of it was still its own thing to process. She was wearing a plain day dress, and her hair was up, but inexpertly with strands loose at the sides, and there was ink on her right index finger, and she looked more like herself, the truest version of herself, than she ever had at Ashford Manor in 3 years of dinners and proper occasions. The scar caught the afternoon light, and he looked at it and felt nothing except a sharp, clear awareness of what he had asked her to cover and what that had cost. "Alexander," she said. Her voice was neutral, not cold, just very controlled. "Charlotte." He stopped himself from saying anything else immediately, because he had learned at some cost that his instinct to fill silences was not always his friend. She set the folder on the table. She hung her coat. She sat down across from him with the deliberateness of a woman deciding how to conduct a meeting she had not scheduled. "Why are you here?" she asked. "I found something this morning," he said. "In the Eastern Holdings correspondence. Something you need to know." He told her what he had told Mrs. Hooper, but in more detail. This time the exact reference, the date, the specific language Beckford's man had used, the clear implication of a plan that had been running for years underneath everything visible. Charlotte listened the same way Mrs. Hooper had, completely still, completely present, not interrupting. But her face was doing something different from Mrs. Hooper's. He could see her fitting it into a framework. She already had the pieces sliding into positions that were opening into something larger. "4 years ago," she said when he finished. "Yes. The same year my grandmother's health began to decline seriously." She looked at the table. "He knew the estate was going to come to me without proper management. He knew I had no experience with property. He knew I was a woman alone." She looked up. "He was simply waiting." "Yes. And your estate manager was part of it." "I believe my estate manager was reporting to Beckford's people on the state of the estate, mine and yours. How vulnerable each was. What opportunities existed." He kept his voice flat and factual, because the anger he felt about it was not the thing she needed right now, and he knew it. "I have the correspondence, all of it. It is yours to use however you need." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "You rode out today specifically to bring me this?" "Yes." "You could have sent a letter." "I could have," he agreed. She looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you?" He did not have a polished answer. He had what was true. "Because I read that correspondence, and I understood that someone has been treating you as a problem to be managed for 4 years. And I—" He stopped. Started again. "I am aware that I have not been different enough from that in my own treatment of you. And I am aware that telling you that is not the same as it being true. But I wanted to bring this to you myself. Not because I am rescuing you. Because I had information that belonged to you and I could not sit on it." Charlotte studied him. He did not look away. He had learned in the months since she left that looking away was a habit of comfort, not of honesty. "Mr. Morse and I found the original land grant document," she said. "He was still. The conditional grant." Her eyes sharpened. "You know about it. I found a reference to it in the correspondence. Beckford's man described it as a potential liability. I did not fully understand what it meant until just now." He leaned forward slightly. "Charlotte, if that grant means what Morse thinks it means, it may mean that Beckford does not legally own land he has held for 30 years, Charlotte said quietly. "Yes, I know." She pressed her fingertips to the table. "Lady Hargrove is writing to a London specialist today. It will take time to confirm. And even if it is confirmed, the legal process will be—" She paused, choosing the word with precision, significant. "You'll need resources." "I have resources." "Charlotte, I have Lady Hargrove and Daniel Morse and a fund that has been running quietly for 11 years, she said. "I am not without support." "I know," he said. "I know that. I am not questioning your capacity to manage this." He said the next thing carefully, because it was true, and he needed her to hear it as true rather than as maneuver. "I have correspondence that documents Beckford's prior knowledge and his coordination with my estate manager. That is evidence. Real dated specific evidence that would be relevant to any legal proceeding you bring." He held her gaze. "I am offering it to you, completely, to use as you see fit, with no conditions." The kitchen was quiet. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "No conditions," she said. "None." "Not even—" She stopped herself. "Not even anything," he said. "I am not using this as a door. I am handing you a document that is yours and walking away if that is what you want." Something moved across her face, not softening exactly, more like a very careful reassessment. The look of a person checking a calculation they had run before and finding a new variable. "I need to think," she said. "Take whatever time you need." I need to think right now in this room while you sit there and don't say anything else for a few minutes." He almost smiled. He caught it. All right. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought. He watched her think and did not speak, and understood that this was perhaps the most genuinely respectful thing he had done in this room, in any room she had occupied, in a very long time. Simply being present, without filling the space with himself. After several minutes, she said, "I want the correspondence. I'll have it sent to you today. All of it, not a summary, the actual documents." "All of it," he agreed. "And I want a written statement from you," she said, "describing how you found the correspondence, when and what it contained. Something I can present to the London solicitor with the documents themselves." She looked at him directly. "Not a favor, evidence. I'll write it tonight." She nodded once. Then, "You should know that Beckford will not take this quietly. When he understands that the legal process has begun in earnest, he will look for pressure points. He will look for ways to complicate things." She paused. "Having your name attached to this as a source makes you a complication for him. He is not a man who responds well to complications." "I know what Beckford is," Alexander said. "You knew him before and did business with him anyway," Charlotte said. Not accusingly, factually. "Yes," Alexander said. "I did, because he was useful and because I did not look closely enough at anything that was useful to me." He did not flinch from it. "That is accurate. I am aware of it." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "How are the Eastern holdings?" she asked. The shift was deliberate, a test he sensed of whether his understanding of his own estate was real or performed. "Damaged but recoverable," he said. "I let go of the estate manager last month. I've been working directly with Daniel Holt, who has been managing the land honestly for 15 years without adequate support or communication from me. We are rebuilding the agreements from scratch. It will take 2 years to fully correct." "What about the tenants who received unfavorable agreements under the old management?" "I am reviewing each one personally," he said, "with Holt beside me. We have corrected 11 so far. There are 9 more to address." Charlotte looked at him. "You're doing it yourself, not through a solicitor." "I thought it was important to look people in the face," Alexander said. "When you are telling someone that they were treated unjustly under your name, they deserve to hear it from you." A silence. "That is the right instinct," Charlotte said quietly. "I am learning," he said. "Later than I should have, but learning." She looked at her hands again. He looked at her. And something happened in that moment that neither of them acknowledged aloud, some small recalibration, some slight closing of a distance that had been entirely right to open, and was now in some very early and uncertain way beginning to consider whether it had accomplished what it needed to. "You can stay for the afternoon," Charlotte said. "Mr. Morse is coming at 4 to review the boundary maps. If you have information about the Eastern Holdings border shared with Beckford's land, it may be relevant." She stood up. "This is not a personal invitation. It is a practical one." "I understand the difference," he said. "Good." She picked up her folder. "I need an hour to review documents first. Mrs. Hooper will make sure you have everything you need." She left the kitchen. He listened to her footsteps go down the hall. He sat at the table and breathed out slowly and looked at the grain of the wood in front of him and thought this is how it should have always been. Her leading. Her deciding. Me following when I have something real to offer and staying quiet when I don't. He thought I should have been this man 3 years ago. He thought I am trying to be him now. Mrs. Hooper appeared and refilled his tea without comment. He drank it. Daniel Morse arrived at 4, with 3 rolls of boundary maps and the careful, calibrated expression of a man who had not expected Alexander's presence, but was professionally equipped to absorb the surprise. They worked around the front room desk. Morse, Charlotte, and Alexander. And the dynamic was unlike anything Alexander had operated in before. Charlotte led. She set the questions, she directed where each map needed to go. She asked Morse specific things, and she asked Alexander specific things, and she synthesized the answers herself without waiting to be told what they meant. He had seen her think before. He had watched her in his library, working through an idea, that particular quality of focus she brought to something that interested her. But he had always been the one setting the context. The room, the books, the permission, the occasion. He had never watched her in her own context with her own materials, operating entirely without reference to whether he was comfortable or informed or keeping up. He kept up, and it cost him real concentration to do so. At one point, Morse said something about the northern boundary notation. Something about a measurement discrepancy in the original survey, and Charlotte said without looking up, "That discrepancy is the key, I think. If the original survey placed the boundary here," she put her finger on the map, "then the conditional clause in the land grant applies to everything east of this line, which includes the Beckford Fields." She looked at Morse. "Am I reading that correctly?" "You are reading it as I read it," Morse said, "which is exactly why we need the London specialist to confirm." "What is the strongest counter-argument Beckford's team will make?" Charlotte asked. "Adverse possession," Morse said immediately. "He's held the land openly for 30 years. He will argue that whatever the original grant conditions, the extended and uncontested possession creates its own legal right. And our response to that the condition was not known to be in dispute," Morse said, "that you could not contest what you did not know about, which is why the documentation of Beckford's prior knowledge," he glanced at Alexander, "is significant. If he knew about the grant condition and concealed it while continuing to hold the land, the adverse possession argument weakens considerably. Because knowing about it and not disclosing it is not uncontested possession," Charlotte said. "It is concealed possession." "Precisely," Morse said. Alexander set the correspondence on the table between them. "This dates from 4 years ago," he said. "The language is explicit. Beckford's man describes the conditional grant as a liability that needed to be resolved before Willowmere changed hands. Which means Beckford knew about the condition, knew it was a problem, and moved to acquire the estate rather than disclose the issue." Both Charlotte and Morse looked at the documents. Morse reached for the page and read it carefully, and his expression, the expression of a cautious man who had been cautious for 20 years, underwent a visible change. "This," he said quietly, "is extraordinary." "Yes," Charlotte said. She looked at Alexander. "You found this today?" "This morning." "And you came here immediately?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the documents and said, "We write to the London specialist tonight. We include copies of everything, the land grant, the boundary survey, the Crane visit, and these." She placed her hand flat on the correspondence. "We request an urgent review." "It will still take weeks," Morse cautioned. "I know," Charlotte said. "We use the weeks well." Morse left at 6. Alexander stayed. Not because Charlotte invited him to stay, for any personal reason. She was professionally neutral through all of it. The way a woman is neutral when she is protecting herself from something she is not yet ready to examine. But there were still questions about the estate boundary on the eastern side, and he had information, and the information was relevant, and so he stayed, and they worked. By 7, they had been at the desk for 3 hours, and Charlotte had produced 4 pages of clear, organized notes and a letter outline to the London specialist, and Alexander had written out his statement of how he found the correspondence, and Mrs. Hooper had brought food without being asked and left it on the corner of the desk without interruption. At some point, Charlotte reached for a piece of bread without looking away from what she was reading, and Alexander automatically moved the plate slightly closer to where her hand was reaching, and she took the bread without noticing, and he watched her do it, and felt the particular quality of being known well enough that a small motion lands accurately. He had not known until this moment how much he had missed that. Not the romance of it, the intimacy of it. The ordinary, irreplaceable intimacy of knowing exactly where someone's hand will reach. At 7:30, Charlotte leaned back in her chair and pressed her hands against her eyes and breathed out. "All right," she said. "Tired?" he asked. "Thinking," she said. She dropped her hands and looked at the ceiling briefly. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." She looked at him. "When you found the correspondence this morning, your immediate instinct was to bring it here, not to sit on it, not to consider how it affected you, not to send a letter and wait." She paused. "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because it was yours. The information belonged to you, and keeping it felt like... He searched for the right word, felt like the wrong kind of silence. You have kept things in the wrong kind of silence before, she said. Directly, not harshly. I know. What is different now? He looked at his hands on the table. The question deserved a real answer, not a reassuring one. I spent a long time, he said slowly, believing that managing things, appearances, situations, people's perceptions was the same as handling them. I was wrong. You showed me I was wrong by leaving, which was the only way the lesson was available to me. He looked at her. I am not different because I decided to be better. I am different because you were right, and I finally understood it. Charlotte was quiet. That is an honest answer, she said. I'm trying to give those more consistently. She looked at the desk between them, covered in maps and documents and notes in both their handwriting. His cramped and slightly backward-leaning, hers, careful and very straight. I am not going to tell you what I feel, she said. I am not ready for that. And I don't want you to take how this afternoon went as a signal that I have answered questions I haven't answered yet. I am not taking it as a signal, he said. I came here today with information. That is all I came with. Good. She looked at him directly. But I want you to know something. What you did today, writing out, bringing this, sitting here for 3 hours, working through boundary maps without once making it about you. She paused. That is the man I thought I was going to marry. The one I was looking for the whole time we were together. The statement landed in him and stayed. How was there? Alexander said quietly. He was just buried under too many layers of what I thought a duke was supposed to be. I know, Charlotte said. I saw him sometimes. That's why it was so hard to leave. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence two people sit in when they have said true things, and the truth needs a moment to settle before anything else can be built on it. Then Charlotte said, I need you to do something for me. Name it. I need you to speak with Lord Beckford directly, she said. Before the London proceedings begin, not as a legal move, as a social one. A conversation between two men of his world. I want him to understand that this is not only Willowmere pursuing this. I want him to understand that you know what his man said to your estate manager, and that you are standing on the other side of it. Alexander understood immediately. You want him rattled before the formal process starts. I want him to understand the dimensions of the situation, Charlotte said carefully. He has been thinking of this as a problem involving one woman with a neglected estate. He needs to recalibrate. He will not take that well. No, Charlotte agreed. He won't. He may retaliate against me directly. He may. She held his gaze. I am not asking you to do this lightly. I am asking because it is the most effective move available, and because you are the only person positioned to make it. She paused. But if you are not willing, I will do it, he said. Alexander. I will do it, he said again. Steadier this time. I should have been in this fight from the beginning. The least I can do is arrive before the end. Something in Charlotte's face shifted. Not dramatically. Not a declaration. Just a very small, very real adjustment. The kind that happens when someone does what you hoped they would do, and you allow yourself quietly to notice it. Thank you, she said. He nodded. I'll arrange to see him next week, he said. Will you have the specialist's initial response by then? I'll write tonight and request it urgently. If I have anything by Friday, I will send word. Send it to me directly, he said. Not through the estate office, directly. All right. He stood. He gathered his things. He looked at her once more, at the desk and the documents and the ink on her finger, and the scar catching the lamplight, and the expression of a woman who was tired and sharp, and entirely, fully, uncomplicatedly herself. Charlotte, he said. Yes. I know this is not the time for anything I have not said yet. He held her gaze. But I want you to know that I am aware of the difference between arriving with information and being someone you can trust. I am not asking you to believe I am the second thing. I am asking only for the chance to demonstrate it over time. Charlotte looked at him. Over time, she said, and the words were not a promise. But they were not a refusal either. They sat in the space between those two things where all genuinely possible futures live. Over time, he agreed. He left. She listened to the front door close, not hard, not soft. Carefully. The door of a man who had been paying attention to how he moved through her space. She sat back at the desk. She looked at the documents. At the maps. At the letter to London waiting to be finished. At the statement in Alexander's handwriting, sitting at the corner of the desk, with its precise, backward-leaning script. She pressed her hand flat over the statement. She thought about over time. Then she picked up her pen and finished the letter to London, because that was the work in front of her, and she was a woman who did the work in front of her. And whatever else was true, could wait for the space that careful, honest, patient work eventually made. She wrote until the lamp burned low. She did not mind. The letter from London arrived on a Monday. Charlotte was at her desk at 6 in the morning, the way she always was with her tea going cold beside her, the way it always did when Mrs. Hooper set the envelope in front of her without a word. The return address was the firm of Alderton and Webb specialists in historical land grants and contested property. The firm Lady Hargrove's London contact had recommended with the specific language. If anyone can confirm this, it is Webb himself. Charlotte did not open it immediately. She held it. She had been waiting 11 days for this letter. 11 days of working through other cases, other documents, other people's problems. While this one question sat underneath everything, like a foundation that might or might not hold weight. She had written to Alexander twice in those 11 days, both times about practical matters, the documents, the Beckford correspondence, the timeline, and he had written back both times promptly with exactly the information she asked for and nothing she didn't. He had gone to see Beckford. He had told her about it in 4 paragraphs, direct and precise, with none of the self-congratulation she had been half bracing for. Beckford had received him politely. Beckford had listened. And then Beckford had said in the particular way of powerful men who have just understood that a situation has shifted, that he was not concerned about old documents, and that Miss Everly was welcome to pursue whatever course she felt appropriate. Alexander had written. He was not as calm as he sounded. His hands were very still, which in my experience of him means the opposite of calm. He knows the correspondence exists. He is assessing his position. Charlotte had read that paragraph 3 times, not for the information which she had absorbed immediately. For the quality of the observation, its accuracy, its restraint, its complete absence of performance. Just here is what I saw. Here is what I believe it means. Here is what I think you should know. She had thought this is the man who was always in there. Then she had put the letter in the desk drawer and gone back to work. Now she opened the envelope from London. The letter was 4 pages. She read it slowly. She read it again faster. She set it down and pressed both hands flat on her desk and looked at the wall and breathed. Edmund Webb's conclusion was careful. It was hedged in the language of legal specialists who understood that conclusions had consequences, but it was clear. The original conditional land grant to Benjamin Hartwell was valid and had never been legally superseded. The conditions described in the grant applied directly to the parcel that had become Beckford's eastern fields. The 30-year possession argument had significant weaknesses given the documented evidence of prior knowledge. Webb's assessment was that the case was not certain. Nothing in law was certain, but it was in his language sufficiently grounded to proceed with confidence. Sufficiently grounded to proceed with confidence. Charlotte read that sentence a 4th time. Then she stood up and she went to the hallway and she said, "Mrs. Hooper." And something in her voice must have carried the weight of what she was holding, because Mrs. Hooper appeared from the kitchen almost immediately with her hands still floury from bread dough and her eyes very direct. "Good or bad?" Mrs. Hooper said. "Good," Charlotte said. "Very good, frighteningly good." Mrs. Hooper looked at her for a long moment. Then she went back to her bread dough without a word. But Charlotte heard her very distinctly say something quiet and satisfied to herself in the kitchen. The sound of a woman whose private assessment had been right and who did not need anyone else to mark the occasion. Charlotte went back to her desk and wrote 3 letters before 7 in the morning. 1 to Lady Hargrove, 1 to Daniel Morse, 1 to Alexander, All three said the same essential thing in three different registers. Webb's assessment is positive. We are proceeding. The response from Alexander came the same afternoon, which meant he had received her letter, read it, and written back within hours of its arrival. She noted that without analysis and moved on. His letter said, "I expected this. I am glad it is confirmed. Beckford will have heard from his own people by now, possibly before your letter reached me. Watch for a response from his side within the week. I have known him for 15 years, and he does not sit quietly with a changed situation. He will make a move, and it will come faster than you expect." He was right. The move came in 4 days. It did not come from Beckford directly. It came from a man named Foster, who wrote to 3 different county newspapers with a letter that described in careful and plausibly deniable language certain concerns about the character and motivations of individuals pursuing frivolous legal challenges against established and respected landowners. The letter did not name Charlotte. It did not need to. Everyone who read it knew exactly who was meant. The language was precise in the particular way of things designed to wound without leaving evidence of the wound. It mentioned disappointed women with personal grievances. It mentioned the misuse of legal instruments by those who lacked the standing to understand them. It mentioned the disruption of community stability by outside interests presenting themselves as charitable. Charlotte read the letter in Lady Hargrove's sitting room, brought by Lady Hargrove herself, who had received it from 2 different sources before noon. When she finished, she set it down on the desk. "He's frightened," she said. "Yes," Lady Hargrove said. "This is not a man who is confident. This is a man who is trying to control the story before the legal process takes it away from him." "Yes," Lady Hargrove said again. Charlotte looked at the letter. "He expects me to be embarrassed. He expects this to make me feel exposed. Illegitimate. The way women always feel when someone publicly questions their right to occupy space." She looked up. "He has miscalculated." Lady Hargrove, for the first time in Charlotte's acquaintance with her, smiled with her whole face. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Nothing," Charlotte said. "I want to do absolutely nothing in response to this letter. I want to let him hear the silence, and I want to keep working, and I want the legal process to speak so loudly that this letter becomes a footnote." She stood. "Can we schedule the formal filing for next week?" "Morse has already prepared it," Lady Hargrove said. "He has been ready for 4 days. Then we file Monday," Charlotte said. "And we do not give Beckford's letter a single word of public response." Lady Hargrove picked up her tea. "I have been doing this work for 11 years, she said. "I have waited 11 years for someone to sit in that chair and say exactly that." Charlotte looked at her. "You've been doing this since before I arrived." "I told you that. You told me you needed someone for the women's casework," Charlotte said. "You did not tell me you had been building towards something considerably larger." "I told you what you needed to hear to walk through the door," Lady Hargrove said with the complete absence of apology of someone who has made a decision she is satisfied with. "Once you were through it, you figured out the rest yourself. That was always the point." Charlotte absorbed that. The particular feeling of a woman who had thought she was finding her own way and discovers that someone wiser than her had quietly left the path clear. "You are a complicated person," Charlotte said. "Yes," said Lady Hargrove serenely. "It has served me well." They filed on Monday. By Tuesday it was known throughout the county. By Wednesday, Charlotte received 7 letters. 3 were from women she had helped directly. Mrs. Fenn, Tom Carver's wife, the elderly woman from the mill cottage, and they said variations of the same thing. "We are glad. We are with you." 2 were from solicitors she had never met offering support in various forms. One was from a clergyman who said he did not fully understand the legal situation, but had heard that she was working to correct an injustice and wished to say that he thought this was right. The 7th letter was from Lord Beckford himself. It arrived without a solicitor's cover. Just Beckford's own stationery. Beckford's own hand. 4 sentences. "Miss Everly, you have been badly advised. This matter will consume years of your life and significant resources, and the outcome is far from guaranteed. I urge you to reconsider before you commit yourself and those around you to a process that will prove not worth its cost. Charlotte read it standing at the hallway table where Mrs. Hooper had left the post. She read it once. Then she carried it to the desk, sat down, and wrote her reply by hand. It took her less than 3 minutes. She read it back once, changed one word, and sealed it. It said, "Lord Beckford, I have been very well advised. I expect this to take the time it takes, and I intend to be here for all of it. The women whose rental agreements were manipulated, the families whose tenancy terms were determined by a man who may not have had legal authority to set them. The people who have lived for 30 years on land that was not properly his to grant, they are also here. We will proceed." She sent it that afternoon. Beckford did not write again. 2 weeks after the filing, Alexander came to Willowmere. He had written first, not to ask permission, but to say he would be coming, which was a distinction Charlotte noted and appreciated. He arrived at 10 in the morning, and this time Mrs. Hooper opened the door with somewhat less assessment in her eyes than the previous visit. Not warmth exactly, but the door opened wider and faster. Charlotte met him in the front room. They stood on opposite sides of her desk. The desk covered in its usual architecture of organized work, and looked at each other, and for the first time since the wedding morning, there was something different in the air between them. Not the charged tension of a confrontation, not the careful neutrality of a business meeting. Something quieter and more complicated than either. "You saw Beckford's letter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "And your response?" "Yes. Lady Hargrove showed me a copy," he said. "I hope that's—" "It's fine," Charlotte said. "She shows Lady Hargrove everything, and Lady Hargrove shows appropriate people. That is how this works." He nodded. "Then, I want to say something, and I want to say it without it being attached to anything, without it being a request or a negotiation or a door I am trying to open." Charlotte looked at him. "Say it." "When I read your response to Beckford," he said, "I thought that is the woman I asked to cover her face." He stopped. He looked at the desk briefly, and then back at her. "I want to say that plainly without softening it, because I think I have spent too much of my time with you softening things that should have been said plainly. What I did that morning was wrong. Not socially inconvenient. Not a misunderstanding. Wrong. And the woman who sent that letter to Beckford is the same woman who was standing in that dressing room, and I was too small to see it." Charlotte was very still. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you know," he said. "I am saying it for myself, because I need to have said it in plain language in this room to your face, not in a letter. Here." A silence. "All right," Charlotte said. "I heard it. Thank you." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had spent 4 months becoming someone she kept recognizing in glimpses, in the 7 pages from Daniel Holt, in the corrected tenancy agreements, in the 4 paragraphs about the Beckford meeting, in the letter that arrived within hours of her own. In the way he had sat at this desk 3 weeks ago and moved the bread plate without thinking. She had been very careful with those recognitions. She had noted them and filed them away, and not allowed herself to build anything from them yet, because building something from glimpses was exactly the mistake she had made for 3 years. But there was a difference she was beginning to understand between caution and punishment, between protecting yourself and refusing to look at what was actually in front of you. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me. I have been very deliberate about not letting this," she gestured between them, "become a thing I was managing toward. I have been deliberate about not letting your changed behavior become a reason to simply return to what we were." She held his gaze. "Because what we were was not right, and I am not interested in returning to it." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to." "But," she said, and the word sat in the room for a moment, "I am also beginning to understand that I have been so careful about not going backward, that I have not let myself consider whether there is anything forward." Alexander did not move. He was very still in the way of someone who has learned to hold still when stillness is required. "Is there?" he asked, quietly, without pressure. Charlotte looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said. I think there might be something worth looking at. Carefully, slowly, without either of us pretending we know what it is before we know." "Carefully and slowly," he said. "Yes, That means I lead, she said. The pace determines what happens next and when. Not because you are being punished, but because that is what respect looks like in this particular situation. I understand, he said. Completely. She looked at him one more time. Then she said, sit down. There are boundary documents that need reviewing, and you know the Eastern Edge better than Morse does. He sat down. He did not smile because he understood that smiling was not the appropriate response to a moment this serious. But something in his face settled the particular settling of a man who has been carrying a long tension and feels for the first time the possibility that it may not have to be carried forever. They worked. The legal process moved the way. Legal processes move not quickly, not cleanly, with delays and procedural requirements and moments that felt like stalling, and moments that felt like progress, and no reliable way to tell which was which from inside the thing. Webb's firm was thorough. Morse was meticulous. Lady Hargrove attended 2 of the preliminary hearings herself, in a hat that Charlotte could only describe as aggressively authoritative, and sat in the back and said nothing, and made everyone in the room aware that she was watching. Beckford's legal team was formidable. Charlotte had expected that. She had not expected how formidable, how many directions they would come from, how exhausting it would be to hold the line while being pressed from 3 angles simultaneously. There was a week in November, gray and cold and relentless, when Charlotte sat at her desk at midnight and put her head in her hands and thought for the first time seriously about what it would mean to lose. Not the money, not even the land, but the people. Mrs. Fenn and the families, and Tom Carver, and the elderly woman from the mill cottage, and the 12 women from Lady Hargrove's Thursday afternoons, and all the people behind them, all the people who had been told for so long that their concerns did not merit proper attention. She thought about what losing would say to them. She pressed her hands against her eyes. Then the floorboard in the doorway moaned its small complaint, and she looked up, and Mrs. Hooper was standing there in her dressing gown with 2 cups of tea. She did not say anything. She set 1 cup in front of Charlotte. She sat in the chair across the desk. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. They sat in the quiet together for a while. I'm not stopping, Charlotte said finally. Not to Mrs. Hooper specifically, to the room, to herself. I know, Mrs. Hooper said. It's just... Charlotte stopped. I know, Mrs. Hooper said again. And that was enough. Charlotte drank her tea and picked up her pen and went back to work. The twist that nobody had been waiting for arrived in December from a direction Charlotte had not considered. One of Beckford's own tenants, a man named Henry Alcott, who had farmed the eastern fields for 22 years, came to Willowmere on a Wednesday morning and asked to see Charlotte. He was 60 years old, broad-handed, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work and something harder than weather. He sat at the kitchen table, and he put a bundle of papers on the table, and he said, I've had these for 15 years, and I didn't know what to do with them. And then I heard about what you were doing, and I thought I should show someone. Charlotte looked at the papers. They were letters. 23 of them dated over a period of 4 years. Between Beckford and his estate agent at the time of the original land acquisition 30 years ago. And they described in the plain language of 2 men who did not expect anyone else to read their correspondence exactly how the acquisition had been managed, including a specific reference to the conditional grant clause, a specific instruction to ensure that the clause was not raised with the selling party, and a specific confirmation that the boundary survey had been adjusted to remove the notation that would have triggered the clause. The survey had been deliberately altered. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table and read 23 letters and understood that what she had was no longer a complicated legal argument about historical interpretation. She had evidence of fraud. She looked at Henry Alcott across the table. Why did you keep these? She asked. I didn't trust him, Alcott said simply. I worked his land for 22 years, and I didn't trust him, and I kept everything I found because I thought someday it would matter. He looked at his hands. Does it matter? Charlotte pressed her hand over the letters. Yes, she said. It matters enormously. She had the letters in Lady Hargrove's hands by noon. She had Webb on a letter that afternoon. She had Alexander informed by evening. Alexander's response arrived the following morning. It was 2 sentences. This ends it. He cannot fight fraud charges and a land claim simultaneously. The fraud alone will require him to settle before this reaches a full hearing. He was right. Beckford's solicitors contacted Webb's firm in January. They were prepared to discuss terms. The settlement took 6 weeks to negotiate and was nothing Charlotte had imagined, and everything she had worked toward, which was not the same as imagined, and was in many ways better. The Eastern Fields did not transfer to Willowmere outright. The legal complexity was too great for a clean transfer, and Webb advised against pursuing it, given the cost and the time. What happened instead was a formal acknowledgement of the original grant's conditions, a restructured set of agreements for the families farming the land that guaranteed fair terms for a generation. A substantial payment into Lady Hargrove's fund to be used specifically for women in legal difficulty in the county, and a drainage agreement at market rate that would fund Willowmere's operational costs for years. Beckford signed. He signed and said nothing, and retired from public county life within the year, which was its own kind of statement. When Charlotte received the signed documents, she sat at her desk for a long time. She looked at the names and the terms and the pages that represented 6 months of fighting, and years of groundwork, and a morning in a wedding dress, and a letter from a tenant named Henry Alcott, and a woman in an aggressive hat who had spent 11 years quietly preparing the ground for this. She thought about all of it. Then she put the documents in the drawer, and she stood up, and she went to the kitchen and told Mrs. Hooper, and Mrs. Hooper said, "Good," and then made a noise that might from a certain angle have been the sound of a woman crying a little, and then went back to the stove with a very composed expression. Charlotte wrote to Lady Hargrove. She wrote to Morse. She wrote to Henry Alcott. She wrote to Mrs. Fenn and Tom Carver, and 12 other people whose names she knew, because she had sat across from them and listened and refused to let their problems be small. The last letter she wrote was to Alexander. It was short. It said, "It is done. We won. I wanted you to know before anyone else told you, because you were part of this in ways that mattered. Thank you. Come to Willowmere on Saturday if you are free. Not for work. Just come." He came on Saturday. It was late winter. One of those mornings that could not quite decide whether it was still cold or beginning to turn the kind of morning that requires a coat, but makes you want to carry it rather than wear it. They walked in the neglected garden because it was the first day in months that either of them had time to simply walk, and because the garden Charlotte had decided was the next project after everything else, the next neglected thing she was going to bring back into its proper shape. They walked without urgency. They talked about small things, and then not so small things, and then small things again. And it was not the way they had talked in the Ashford Library. That brilliant, charged, effortful conversation that had always been partly performance and partly real. This was entirely real. 2 people talking the way people talk when they have run out of reasons to be careful. At some point, they stopped walking. Charlotte did not plan it. They simply stopped, and they were standing near the old section of the garden wall, and the morning had made up its mind toward warmth, and she was looking at a climbing vine that had gone completely wild, and was thinking she would need to cut it back hard to save it, which was always the counterintuitive thing about neglected growing things. You had to be willing to cut away what they had become in order to reach what they could be. She said, without particularly deciding to say it, "I'm not the same person who left Ashford Manor." Alexander looked at her. "I know. I need you to understand that I mean that completely, not as a figure of speech." She looked at the vine. The woman who stood in that dressing room, she loved you, and she wanted so badly to believe that love was enough to make the rest right. She kept trying to find ways to make the situation workable. She paused. "I don't do that anymore. I don't find ways to make myself workable. I am what I am, and I require someone who can stand next to that without needing to manage it." "Yes," Alexander said. "You say yes very readily," she said. "Because I mean it without reservation," he said. "Not because I have practiced it. Because 6 months of watching you build something from the ground up while simultaneously fighting a man who had 30 years and 3 times the resources. Charlotte. I have no interest in managing you. I would not know where to begin, and I wouldn't want to." He looked at her. "I want to stand next to it. All of it. The desk and the documents and the midnight tea and the letters you write at 6 in the morning and the way you move the bread plate without looking. All of it. I want to stand next to that and be useful when I can be, and stay out of the way when I can't." Charlotte looked at him. She thought about a morning in an ivory gown and a ring she had taken off and placed on a desk. She thought about the carriage ride and the east-facing window and the first night with the accounts ledger. She thought about Mrs. Fenn and Tom Carver and Henry Alcott and 23 letters that changed everything. She thought about a man who had ridden 20 miles with documents that belonged to her and sat for 3 hours reviewing boundary maps without making it about himself. She thought about overtime. "I am not giving you the ring back," she said. "I know. If this is something, whatever this becomes, it starts from here, from who we both are now, not from what we were." "Yes," he said. "And I lead," she said. "Still." "Always," he said, and he meant it, and she could hear that he meant it. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she said, "All right." 2 words. Quiet. Not a declaration, and not a vow, and not a fairy tale ending. Something better and more real than any of those things. A clear-eyed, deliberate, fully informed yes from a woman who knew exactly what she was agreeing to and exactly what she was worth. She turned and looked at the wild climbing vine on the old garden wall. "This will take real work," she said. "About the vine, about all of it." "I know," Alexander said. He was looking at it too. "Tell me where to start." And Charlotte Everly, who had removed a duke's ring before her wedding and walked out of a perfect life to build a true one, who had sat at a kitchen table with strangers' problems until they became her own cause, who had faced a powerful man's fraud with 23 letters, and a woman in an aggressive hat, and her own furious refusal to be small, looked at the tangled, difficult, entirely possible garden, and began. She did not need saving. She never had. She needed only what she had built herself: the clarity to see what was real, the courage to name it plainly, and the knowledge hard-won, bone-deep and permanent, that a woman who refuses to disappear is not a problem to be managed. She is the whole